Well, welcome everybody to this live webcast event of the Cato Institute on economic sanctions during a pandemic. Normally, I'd be addressing the audience from behind a podium and on a stage, but due to the coronavirus, we are here doing this from the comfort of our homes. And I do want to thank Cato's events and conference teams for enabling us to do this. It really would not be possible without them. I also want to remind our viewing audience that there is a Q&A session that will take place for most of the second half of this event, and we're taking questions for our two panelists. So you can submit your questions at any time via the webpage for this event at cato.org or on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, where this event is being streamed, and you can use the hashtag CatoFP. So the onset of this pandemic has renewed debate over the use and potential overuse of economic sanctions as a tool of statecraft. And I'll just kind of very briefly review some recent chronology here with regard to Iran in particular. So the Obama administration engaged in arduous years-long negotiations with Iran and the other great powers, the UN Security Council, plus Germany, and came up with a non-proliferation agreement which rolled back Iran's nuclear program and imposed very stringent restrictions and inspections regime. And in return, sanctions were supposed to be lifted. Donald Trump campaigned against this. He vowed to tear up the deal. And initially, his cabinet did resist. The principals in his cabinet did resist, pointing mainly to U.S. intelligence and information from the International Atomic Energy Agency that goes in and inspects Iran, that Iran was in fact complying and that sanctions release should continue. Trump overcame this internal resistance by May 2018 when he withdrew from the deal despite Iranian compliance, and then he moved towards a policy of what he calls maximum pressure, which has imposed harsh sanctions on Iran, really undermine their economy, and it seems to have incentivized them to act out in ways that are not all that constructive, including by making calculated violations to the Iranian nuclear deal and kind of acting out in the region. Seems to me, at least, the maximum pressure policy has sort of brought about exactly the set of Iranian policies that it was supposed to deter or avoid. And throughout the sanctions regime, there was a lot of outcry on humanitarian grounds before COVID-19 hit. There were complaints that the completeness and the harshness of the sanctions regime was preventing much needed medical supplies from entering the country and hampering their response to COVID. But before this, it was complaints about not only the overall economic impact and how that's hurting ordinary Iranians, but also cancer patients, hemophilia patients. I mean, there were these complaints about the humanitarian impact of the sanctions for a long time. But now with COVID-19, there are renewed calls for lifting these, or at least waiving some of them. There have been a number of open letters with prominent U.S. officials and former U.S. officials, senators and ambassadors and secretaries of state and so on. The UN General Secretary has also called for waiving of sanctions against countries like Iran and Cuba and North Korea and Venezuela so that they can help, they can manage this crisis in a way that is not impinged by unnecessary sanctions. And so we'll discuss the state of U.S.-Iran policy in this context, but also we'll broaden the discussion a bit more to address sanctions policy in general. We just recently published a paper at the Cato Institute on sanctions, and it reviewed the academic literature, and it turns out, well, how should I put this? Academic rigor has not been kind to advocates of sanctions. They tend to be not super effective, or at least the causal mechanism here of economic pressure doesn't seem to be easily identifiable in terms of leading to the desired policy on the part of the target state. They keep being used, this paper argued, primarily because it's an easy low cost, politically convenient way to have a policy towards something when you don't really know what else to do, but sanctions sound like a tough and smart approach. Joining us in this discussion is Richard Nephew and Emma Ashford. Richard Nephew is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Previously, he was the principal deputy coordinator for sanctions policy at the Department of State, where he focused on Iran policy. So he'll have a lot to say about that. Emma Ashford is a research fellow at the Cato Institute and focuses a lot on energy and geopolitics, and definitely relevant for the Middle East. So Richard, why don't you start us off, and then we'll move on to Emma. How do you view sanctions in the context of the current pandemic, and also with Iran in particular, and then maybe if you can broaden it to sanctions use in general?
Sure, very happy to, and thanks very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with both of you, and then obviously with your audience. Now, I think the simplest and most straightforward statement that needs to be made about sanctions in the pandemic is, sanctions didn't cause the pandemic, of course, but they are absolutely making it worse, at least in the Iran circumstance, and potentially in other sanctioned countries. There are, of course, exemptions to sanctions that can also normally facilitate humanitarian trade. And in fact, in the U.S., ever since the 2000 Trade Sanctions Reform Act, as well as various different exemptions built into executive orders, there have been ways of engaging in trade with sanctioned jurisdictions and providing humanitarian goods, whether that's food, medicine, medical devices. And in fact, in the Obama administration, we sought several times to broaden the extent of the exemptions with regard to medicine with respect to Iran. The big issue, though, is that in a normal environment, that might be enough. When you have got normal supply chains, normal business activity, when you have normal banking and normal manufacturing and those sorts of things. In the context of the pandemic, all of the difficulties and problems created by sanctions are exacerbated with respect to the countries that are currently under sanctions. And Iran is, of course, one of the most significant cases in point. This is in part because, of course, sanctions intend to interfere with normal trade. Their objective is to make normal trade and normal business activity much more difficult and much more complicated. That is part of the way in which sanctions can be effective. By making normal trade much more difficult, much more complex, and much more costly, sanctions aim to persuade companies, banks, and businesses in general to avoid engaging with the sanctioned jurisdictions. And quite naturally, in the current environment, this means that Iran is having a much more difficult time importing items that it might otherwise wish to obtain, especially with regard to humanitarian goods. But it's not simply just because of the fact that sanctions do preclude, as a matter of law, some business ties. It's also that they change the business cost-benefit equations that companies are operating under. So if a company would normally say, look, it costs a certain amount to engage in business with this particular country, we have to add a certain amount for compliance, to deal with sanctions issues that have nothing to do with a problematic relationship. Maybe they deal with blood diamond trafficking, or maybe they deal with terrorism financing, money laundering, those sorts of things. For sanctioned jurisdictions, those costs have to go up a lot more. Then they have to look and see what are the advantages, what are the opportunities that potentially can come about as a result of doing business. And in places where you've got a heavy sanctions load, where a lot of the sectors in the economy are under that sanctions load, that's where I think you start to see a very clear mismatch, because the incentives are quite low, the costs are quite high. And when you put that together, it's very hard for a responsible business to make the decision to continue engaging in trade. And so the result, of course, is that you have undermined the incentives to remain engaged with Iran more generally, especially with respect to banks. If the only kinds of trade and business activity that are going to be permitted are in humanitarian spaces, those may not be sufficient value, to justify continuing to have the business relationships. And so now I think the problem is that in the context of a pandemic, reconnecting Iran to be able to engage in some of this humanitarian trade without active U.S. government intervention is pretty hard. Comfort simply does not exist in terms of doing business with Iran. In fact, the State Department just made that a lot more difficulty by putting out a fact sheet that said that humanitarian trade with Iran is potentially a scam-ridden activity in which companies and businesses and banks are going to be taken advantage of by the IRGC and by other problematic parts of the Iranian business community and government. When you add that to the fact that there simply is no business interest and incentives, you can see part of the reason why it's very difficult for Iran to be able to obtain the items that it wishes to obtain, even if legally it would be able to do so. Now, there are solutions to this problem beyond just simply suspend sanctions. And I should hasten to note that people suggesting this are not just simply trying to engage in an attempt to claw back the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and get that back into place. Although I'll say I would gladly sign up for such a thing right now. Frankly, I don't even think suspending U.S. sanctions would be the most efficient way of getting aid and support inside of Iran. If you just simply suspended sanctions for the duration of the crisis, you potentially create the same sorts of compliance headaches and burdens that already existed, where companies don't know where their lines are, they don't know how long the crisis will remain, and so they would be a little unsure as to exactly how long they can engage in trade, what are the dimensions of that engagement. I actually think that a much more structured approach in which the United States engages with the corporate sector and with Iran to facilitate specific transactions and specific transaction patterns where you have certain shippers and certain manufacturers and others involved is a much more efficient way of doing this, and a much more efficient way of getting assistance and support into Iran. I do think as well that this would help you as a U.S. government and more generally to sidestep the issue of the JCPOA and to ensure that the primary focus of what you're doing is that of providing humanitarian assistance in the midst of a pandemic. Now, of course, there are 5 broader implications of failing to do so. The first and potentially most important is that you potentially make the pandemic much worse. The fact of the matter is Iran is a primary vector for the transfer of the pandemic to other places in the Middle East and potentially to other parts of Central Asia. And of course, if that were to take place, it potentially undermines a lot of the efforts being done now to restrain the spread of the virus. It also, of course, reinforces the Iranian domestic propaganda machine about aims in U.S. policy. And I think that the Iranians right now have got ample indications the U.S. is not intended to try and engage in a serious negotiation, but is instead aimed at regime change. And I think this ties to my second point, or my third point rather, that it undermines the concept that max pressure is even intended for a legitimate effort at diplomacy, which is going to complicate future diplomacy for Iran and the United States, regardless of who wins the presidential election coming up in November. And this is a fourth main point. I think that there are many right now who think that if Biden wins, there'll be a restart of negotiations. It's possible that if Trump wins, there'll be an attempt to restart negotiations. All of this will be complicated by a humanitarian catastrophe that we're doing very little to try and address. And last, of course, there's the broader implications for the U.S. ability to use sanctions in the future. I think a lot of countries around the world are looking at us right now to see, are we prepared to demonstrate that our sanctions are not intended to have a humanitarian impact, and they're seeing us fail that test. And I think that ultimately will make it harder to get countries to join with us when we pursue sanctions campaigns in places where they are seriously needed, where they will be a complement to diplomacy as part of a broader strategic attempt to address issues that exist. And I think that would be both a problem in terms of how U.S. administrations can deal with future international issues, but potentially a very dangerous one if that meant that our options would be far more limited in future conflict scenarios.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I want to remind everybody that you can submit questions at any time on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, or on the Cato.org webpage. The early ones are getting precedence, just FYI. Emma, take it away.
Hey, thanks to everybody for watching this. Welcome to my basement. It's a strange new world. I'm going to try and not repeat a lot of stuff Richard says, but there's a fairly similar flavor to the remarks that I prepared for today. So I see sanctions during this pandemic as sort of indicative of the broader problems that we're having with sanctions. So John already provided a very brief overview of sanctions as they are today, as they've been used in recent years. But I want to make just a couple of quick points. So the first is that sanctions are somewhat better than they used to be. If you go back to the 1990s and we're talking about comprehensive embargoes of a state, something like the sanctions that we put on Iraq under Saddam Hussein, those had terrible humanitarian impact. And today's targeted sanctions that are mostly financial in nature tend to be a little better even on humanitarian issues. Second point is we use sanctions for a lot of different things. Again, Iran tends to come up a lot, and that's a case where we're talking about a state whose behavior we want to change. But we also use sanctions for anti-terrorism, interdicting terror financing, for human rights or pro-democracy issues, for trying to prevent the illegal arms trade. We use them in places like Syria when there's civil wars. And a specialist a couple of years back actually referred to sanctions as the tool of first resort for the U.S. government, and that is in many ways what they've become. As John pointed out, sanctions lie between doing nothing and using force. And that means that even if they have negative implications, they tend to be more palatable, more acceptable to policymakers. And so we tend to see them used in a lot of crises rather than other policy tools. We saw increasing usage initially under the George W. Bush administration, particularly under the Obama administration. In both cases, those were generally tethered to policy goals. The negotiation of the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, would not have been possible without a good multilateral sanctions initiative. And so I would perhaps take issue with John's claim that sanctions never work. They do work occasionally in certain circumstances. But it is very true that there are some nasty side effects to sanctions. So the policy paper that Cato put out just a few weeks back from Richard Hanania, it was talking about sanctions and how they impact different countries. I believe the title was Ineffective, Immoral, Politically Inconvenient, or politically convenient, why sanctions aren't necessarily the best tool. And in that paper, he gives the example of Syria. And while it's very difficult to disentangle deaths in the civil war from deaths caused by sanctions, the facts are that US sanctions substantially worsened the Syrian economy in that case. And so his point is that we need to be aware that there are these side effects. So under the Trump administration, we've seen a massive amount of new sanctions. They really are treating this as the tool of first resort to be used in all situations. Particular targets include Iran and Venezuela, are perhaps the two most obvious. But there's four big trends that I wanted to sort of draw our attention to before coming back to the coronavirus situation. So the first is that under the Trump administration, we've seen an increasing use of sanctions against allies, and the increasing use of sanctions applied in an extraterritorial sense. That is to say, sanctions used applying US law to companies that are foreign companies. This has been done before, but typically, so if you take the Obama administration's negotiations prior to the JCPOA, they worked with European companies sort of rather than just imposing our will on other countries and their companies. The Trump administration has largely relied on extraterritoriality to force other countries and their companies to do what we want. And this has occasioned a substantial amount of backlash. So in recent weeks, we've seen the first successful use of the INSTEX mechanism. That's a way for Europe and Iran to barter with one another and to trade. In this case, it was humanitarian trade, which is technically allowed, but it offers the opportunity for other forms of trade. Second trend that I want to sort of draw attention to. The Trump administration has pursued a policy against Iran that they described as maximum pressure. The same language has also been used for North Korea. We haven't seen that language necessarily used in Venezuela, but the approach has been pretty much the same. And what this really means at heart is that the sanctions on these countries are largely untethered from any concrete policy goals. So sanctions work best when they are narrowly focused and have a specific, narrowly scoped policy goal in mind. In the case of Iran, in the case of Venezuela, in the case of North Korea, to some extent, what we're seeing is sanctions focused on something like regime change that is almost impossible to achieve. And we're also, in many of these cases, seeing the diminishing return of sanctions. The initial time that you put sanctions on a country, they can be quite effective. But once you've piled more and more and more sanctions on, they become increasingly less effective. And so we're in the situation where policymakers continue to add sanctions to Iran. There's nothing left to sanction effectively. So a third trend that I want to call attention to, increasing humanitarian problems with sanctions. This has always been somewhat of an issue, and it's pretty difficult to untangle the impact of sanctions on humanitarian issues versus the impact of bad governance or civil war or any of a number of other factors that might be at play. But as Richard described really well, things like food and medicine imports, even though they're technically excluded from the sanctions, they can be affected by the fact that we shut down trade. So if your banks in a country like Iran or North Korea are barred from trading with other banks, from transferring money to them, it becomes very difficult for companies to buy food. How can hospitals seek to buy medical equipment if they can't actually transfer money? And that's the problem that Instex is designed to resolve, but it exists in a much broader variety of cases. So then a fourth, less a trend and just a point that I would make about sanctions under the Trump administration. None of these sanctions are working. Sanctions generally do fail. The academic literature is quite clear on that. They succeed only in very limited cases, when we are seeking a very specific policy change, when we apply appropriate pressure, and when we're willing to make concessions to do so. 90%, 99% of what the Trump administration is doing with sanctions does not meet that bar. And so the sanctions that they have put on over the last 3 years, or they have added to, are not working. So I raise those points not so much to sort of give a general lecture on sanctions, but because I think that it's important to understand that the problems we're seeing today with sanctions during the coronavirus are not just the result of the disease. It's the fact that our sanctions policy already had substantive problems with it. The pandemic is making it far more difficult and is making these general problems much more salient even than they were before. And so, Richard did a wonderful job of talking about the humanitarian impacts. Even though the humanitarian trade is technically excluded, we're seeing that countries like Iran or Venezuela or others are not able to obtain things like medical equipment. Even outside of sanctions, we're seeing things like the US government stepping in to prevent both Iran and Venezuela from getting loans from the International Monetary Fund. And this is in a situation where Iran, for example, has a death toll from coronavirus twice that of the Iran-Iraq War. Which was a massive cultural scar on that country. So we are talking about genuine privation here. Sanctions are making it very difficult to actually resolve the crisis. Another problem that I think the coronavirus brings to the fore here is the question of whether these impacts are truly side effects or not. And it comes to what I've started to think of as the increasing embargoization of targeted sanctions. So the idea that targeted sanctions in a lot of cases start very small and narrowly focused on government elites or on specific companies, and then end up expanded over time to include more and more parts of an economy. And at the end of the day, if the goal is, in the case of Iran, say, to just cause widespread economic pain, to force the people of that state to, say, rise up against their government, as the Trump administration has suggested, it's not clear to me that the humanitarian impacts are a side effect rather than the actual impact of the sanctions. So we need to be clear about what we're doing here. If this is what we are using sanctions for, we need to be aware that they're causing a lot of pain to innocent people. And this also brings me to another trend, which is the idea that sanctions appear to be increasingly used as a form of punishment rather than as a tool of coercion. So the idea that the Trump administration talks a lot about sanctions and about their ability to cause economic pain and don't really have very clear ideas for how those sanctions could be lifted, for how governments could get out from under them, for how we actually achieve policy goals with them. So I think the pandemic is sort of increasing all of these trends, perhaps accelerating some of them, even things like the use of sanctions against allies, but they're all underlying problems that were already there, and they will persist into the next administration, whether it's another Trump administration or whether it's a Democratic administration. So I'm going to wrap up in just a second, but before I do, I also wanted to throw one more topic into the mix, because there's been increasing talk, particularly in right-wing media, about the idea of sanctioning China, that they should compensate us for the government's missteps as they relate to coronavirus. And there's a conspiracy theory version of this in which China created a bioweapon, and that's not true. But there's also a version of this in which conservatives argue that because China covered up the initial extent of the virus, hid death tolls, that they are in many ways complicit for the spread of the pandemic afterwards. And economic sanctions is one of the options that's being suggested here. Things like targeted sanctions on individuals, asset freezes for senior Communist Party officials, the seizure of Chinese companies abroad as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And most of this is being touted in the name of promoting transparency on public health initiatives. So we've got Tom Cotton, for example, proposing one such sanctions program, which would be kind of a Magnitsky Act, which is Russia-focused sanctions. But in this case, it would be for China. It would be on public health. But in a lot of cases, what we're seeing is just politicians that already wanted to impose these sanctions on China for human rights issues in places like Xinjiang, for issues related to Huawei and espionage, corporate espionage. So these are sort of the same sanctions proposals that have been made before, coming out of the woodwork again, in this case suggested as a response to the coronavirus. So that's a policy debate that I think we're going to see more of over the next few months. So I'm going to wrap up there and pass it back to John, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you both. You guys addressed some of the questions that had already come in, so that's good. Quickly to Mark Fitzpatrick from IISS asked about these reports from earlier in the month where the U.S. government is planning to veto that IMF loan to Iran. If either of you want to expand a bit on that, please do. I'll slip in a second question right before, which is, these are kind of related. So first of all, this is from Anonymous. NGOs are saying OFAC's licensing process is unworkable, slow, creates unnecessary restrictions. How does this square with Mr. Nephew's comment that a structured approach to facilitate transfers would be more efficient than suspending sanctions for a certain period of time? So Richard, that second one is clearly for you, but either of you can take a whack at the first one.
Sure. If you want, I'll give it a go, and then turn things over to Emma. So, first on the vetoing an IMF loan, my understanding is that the terms under which this loan is being requested make it very difficult for the United States to veto it. Under some of the voting rules that the IMF operates under, we have effectively a individual majority and veto based on the amount of money that we've contributed and the number of voting rights that we have. My understanding is that is not, in fact, the case with respect to the emergency loan request vehicle that's been made here. And so consequently, while we do have a large number of votes and a large number of shares in which we can vote, other countries have as well. And so I think that rather than being in a position to veto from a kind of strictly normal usage of that term. It's more that the U.S. is trying to block it, probably by seeking other vote holders to join with us in blocking it. My understanding, though, is that the part of the delay is that the IMF itself is still assessing the situation, assessing the request, and so forth. And so that might also be part of the reason why it hasn't actually come for a formal decision and been either given a yes or a no. And again, that's current as of this morning. In terms of the licensing process, look, I think a couple of things are relevant here. First, part of what I am suggesting actually gets you away from having to go after some of the individual license requirements, right? And to try and bridge the gap between what would be a normal specific license request, where you go to OFAC and say, I'd like to do the following things with the following people, and we'll be doing it in the following time frame. And instead, try and get closer to a general license where if certain facts match certain patterns, then business is considered okay from the standpoint of OFAC. And the idea would be that you would have what's been sometimes called a white channel, what sometimes has been called a series of comfort letters, but that you would identify in advance banks that are seen as having sufficient due diligence requirements and screening, same thing with insurers and shippers and manufacturers and others, that could become a pipeline through which aid could be directed into Iran. That's not going to eliminate some of the delays with regard to specific licenses, some of which are caused by the complexity of doing business in Iran, some of which are caused by the complexity of doing business in a coronavirus quarantine Washington, where OFAC workers are working from home, at least in large numbers, and making doing license reviews much more complicated. But it would be something that potentially could complement the specific licensing process and allow for at least some degree of support and assistance to move in a easier fashion than what is presently the case. And it's worth noting, of course, that the time required to set that up may also be considerable. You got to find banks, insurers, and shippers, and others that are in a position to do this sort of business. And so that's why it's incumbent on Treasury and the U.S. government more generally to get going on it soon.
Yeah, so I will just add on the first question. So the IMF is still considering the loan to Iran, although, like most people, I'm hearing rumors that the U.S. is trying to shut that down. In the case of Venezuela, though, the loan has actually been rejected. The official reason was that that there's no clarity on who the Venezuelan government is at this point. But again, there's some fairly strong sort of U.S. influence there, given it's the U.S. that's sort of backing the potential government of Juan Guaido against the government existing of Nicolas Maduro. So slightly different situations, but in both cases, there has been U.S. influence to try and prevent this, if not an outright veto.
Another question from an anonymous questioner asks, how might sanctions affect America's position atop the international economy, specifically the dominance of the US dollar? Are other countries expressing greater interest in alternative economic arrangements that can reduce their exposure to US sanctions? I want to fit in another one as well, so keep that one in mind. Also, let's see here. Let's ask another anonymous question, which is, do either of you see any chance that the Trump administration will respond to this growing pressure to change its approach to sanctions, at the very least for the duration of this crisis? Richard, you can go first, and then Emma.
Okay, sure. So, on the last question first, no, I don't see there's any real chance of them changing their approach. I mean, I think that there is some remote possibility that the crisis gets far, far, far worse, and they change their approach. To me, I think that's pretty unlikely, given the cast of characters who are running the government right now, and the fact that we only have another 6 odd months of the first term of the Trump administration, maybe the only term of the Trump administration. So I don't think that we should expect to see much of a change. In terms of affecting the use of the dollar, and I'd be very interested in Emma's thoughts on this as well, Look, I think that the dollar is an interesting element of what I think is a much bigger problem. I think that the dollar as a reserve currency is still going to be a very powerful instrument for the U.S. and a very powerful instrument for international finance because it's hard to see a replacement stepping up that people feel comfortable in. And I actually think if you look at recent, turmoil affecting markets, you can see that there is still a general desire to get into the dollar. There's still a desire to get into treasuries when crises happen. Sometimes there's weirdness attached to that. Sometimes that's not as comfortable, especially when in the context of dealing with the pandemic of a massive stimulus that's being proposed. But still, people weren't rushing out to buy a whole bunch of yen, at least not that I saw. And I think that speaks to the fundamental of the value of the dollar. I think the bigger problem is the possibility of de-risking from the U.S. altogether and the emergence of alternative mechanisms for engaging in transactions. By alternative, I don't mean replacing the dollar and replacing the United States, but rather that people come up with ways in which they don't have to transact through the U.S. financial system in which to do business. They avoid supply chains that are wholly dependent on the U.S., and they avoid having banking operations that have to funnel transactions through New York to avoid the U.S. jurisdiction. And all that comes with potential real costs to the U.S., both economically as well as geostrategically. Because, of course, part of the reason why sanctions work is because people want to do business here. If they find ways of protecting themselves against the risk they're perceiving, because I agree with them very much that U.S. sanctions are just on a massive trajectory up right now. I think that that ultimately will have an effect on our ability to use those tools and certainly our ability to take advantage of our economic position that over the last 50, 60 years has been of considerable benefit for us.
Yeah, so so I very much agree with Richard on the de-dollarization question. If that is a trend, if that is something that happens, it's going to be on a very long time scale. We've really only seen a couple of things that suggest countries are even really considering it as an option. There was an oil swap between Russia and China a few years back that happened in RMB rather than in dollars. That's really about the only sort of major example I can even think of off the top of my head. And so this is something that's not really happening. But the de-risking trend that Richard talked about is a much bigger one. And so the risk is less, I think, that companies seek to avoid the US dollar, that they don't want to do business in it. And it's much more that they come up with these very creative strategies to work around being exposed to the US market. And it's a long-term issue. So in the case of something like, say, a bank in Europe that decides that it wants to do business with a sanctioned entity abroad, there are eventually going to be ways like the Instex mechanism, which is effectively a barter mechanism, where these companies and banks will try and work around it. And what concerns me is not countries like China or North Korea or Iran finding ways around these sanctions. What really concerns me is the fact that we are now seeing particularly European countries looking for ways to shield their companies from US sanctions. So this isn't us talking about a handful of rogue states. This isn't even us talking about great power competition with China. This is us talking about NATO allies. And we are applying sanctions extraterritorially in a way that makes companies in France and Germany so angry they go to their government, that makes the French and German governments try and find a way to shield their companies to work against US sanctions. And so I am far more worried about the risks that are coming from our allies than from countries we would typically consider as actually under sanctions. And I think the Trump administration's willingness to put tariffs and sanctions and all sorts of stuff on allies without considering those consequences, that's where the risk of this sort of long-term trend really grows.
Very good. I'll slip in two more. One from Sina Azodi to either of you. What is your response to the Department of State's constant line that with regard to Iran, food and medicine are not sanctioned? Second one from Ashley here. How would you respond to the argument that the regime's continued spending on proxy forces is evidence that the government has the resources needed to secure humanitarian goods if it prioritizes that kind of spending. Emma, why don't you go first this time, then Richard?
Sure, yeah. So I'll take the second question and leave the first one for you, perhaps. In terms of the Trump administration, they have taken this line with a number of countries that it's not the fault of the U.S., that it's not the fault of the Trump administration that people are suffering humanitarian impacts, because if these governments just changed their behavior and spent money elsewhere, people wouldn't be suffering. And on some level, right, that is a fair criticism. It is not just the fault of the US that people in Iran are unable to access medical aid, but it is partly the fault of the US and partly the fault of US sanctions, and our sanctions are making things worse. And so I think we're also deluding ourselves if we think that kind of statement basically removes any culpability from us. And even if you think that this is not just a moral argument, and you're talking in terms of just pure cost benefit to the US during the pandemic, it's not in American interests for us to let this virus rage out of control in a country that could potentially then spread it elsewhere. So, I mean, I'm not convinced by the moral argument, and I think the Trump administration is also completely ignoring the what is actually good for us debate.
Yeah, and let me say, I would agree very much with everything you just said, Emma, with regard to the second question. I think part of the problem, too, with that as an argument is it automatically starts bringing in, who are you to determine what's a good policy for us, right? I remember back in the 2004, 2005 timeframe, we were, on a much less controversial matter, we were suggesting that Iran's nuclear program was a waste of money, that instead that they should just capture the gases that they're flaring when they produce natural gas, and they wouldn't need a nuclear program because it'd be much more useful for their economy, et cetera. That all may have been true. The response that we got out of both the Iranians as well as the broader national community was, and that's a policy choice that a sovereign country can potentially make. And so from that standpoint, it may be a useful talking point inside of Washington. Whether or not it is persuasive to anyone else, I think, is a completely secondary point. I think it just merits being considered. On the first, look, I think that the fundamental point is the Trump administration is telling the truth when they say that food and medicine are not subject to U.S. sanctions. That's true. That is absolutely true. From the standpoint of, are you allowed to export those goods from the United States or from anywhere else to Iran? Yes. Can you engage with banks to do that? Yes. Can you engage with shipping companies to do that? Yes. Can you engage with insurers to do that? Yes. All those things are legal. All those transactions can happen right now under U.S. law. There's nothing else that needs to be done. It's utterly immaterial to the point, which is, are U.S. sanctions making it impossible for legal transactions to take place? Yes, they absolutely are. And that's because, again, we've undermined the business case for having any kind of trade ties with Iran, with banks maintaining any kind of correspondent banking account relationships with Iran, with ships going to Iran, with insurers being prepared to insure goods going to Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And some of this comes from a not unreasonable response to what Iran itself does in terms of its sanctions evasion. The fact of the matter is the IRGC and others do engage in widespread sanctions evasion. They use false bills of lading, and they use misleading, from companies to be able to engage in illicit transactions and so forth, thus creating a massive compliance burden, which is also partly their responsibility. But the simple reality is that U.S. sanctions still, notwithstanding all of that, make it impossible for most companies, and certainly anyone other than the biggest ones, to engage in this sort of trade. And again, in a non-pandemic situation, that might be something that you could have a debating discussion about, whether or not it's something that Iran needs to do more to solve, or whether or not the United States needs to. In a pandemic where you've had widespread economic dislocation, where you've had widespread prevention of humanitarian goods from getting in, where you've got fights over who's going to be able to get PPE equipment and other such things in. It adds up to an insurmountable set of obstacles. And so from that standpoint, the question then is less, are sanctions responsible, and more of, is there a way in which sanctions can both still be directed at their intention, which is to undermine Iran's ability to engage in illicit conduct, while at the same time addressing a humanitarian problem, especially for an administration that has said that part of the reason why we're doing all of this is because we stand with the Iranian people. And I think this is what makes the Trump administration's positions on this right now so counterproductive. They are saying that not only is there no problem, it is not our fault if there is a problem, and the Iranians bear all the blame for all this. Well, okay, that might be a satisfactory set of talking points inside of Washington, but there are very real-world complications that come along with that as a set of positions. And I think that the administration is not thinking creatively or long-term enough about what it can and should do to try and address the humanitarian consequences that are a natural byproduct of the sanctions regime that we have created.
So this will be a slight shift in topic, but Tom Brooks from GWU asks a question that a lot of people are asking, which is sanctions on North Korea. Have they been effective? Have they yielded policy victories? And what is the status of them right now? Richard, maybe you want to start.
Sure, happy to. So this is where actually I luckily get the opportunity to come back to your opening presentation and talk a little bit about the overall effectiveness of sanctions as a tool. Look, I think if we put our viewpoint that sanctions are only effective if the underlying strategy is effective, then I think it's easy to say that sanctions on North Korea have been a failure. But is the problem the strategy and our objectives, or is the problem the tool that's being used? And I think that the problem with sanctions over the course of the last 20 to 30 years, you could make an argument much longer, has been that we have confused strategy with tool and tool with strategy. Sanctions only work when they are part of a multi-tool approach taken by a government, where the U.S. in this case is engaging in diplomatic activity, is using pressure to create leverage for diplomacy, potentially a threat of military action to create additional pressure, is looking creatively at potential negotiated solutions and incentive structures, etc. That is an integrated, holistic strategy that aims to address a particular problem. We're not doing that in many cases. Instead, what we're doing is simply applying sanctions and then essentially hoping that the outcome after that is something that we view as positive. The other problem is that we oftentimes, in my view, identify our objectives as things that are wholly unrealistic, or may have been once upon a time realistic, but have since become not so. North Korea, to my mind, is a perfect case in point. 20 years ago, it may have been a realistic objective that we will get North Korea to abandon nuclear weapons, and we will use sanctions pressure to coerce them to go into negotiations to achieve that. That may have been a reasonable set of objectives for a national strategy. It's hard to see how credible that is at present. It's certainly the case that Kim Jong-un has prioritized nuclear weapons as part of his national strategic doctrine. Certainly he has said that he'd be prepared to negotiate in furtherance of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I don't know of any Korea scholar who thinks that he believes he means to do that first, or certainly as part of a near-term approach to addressing the problem. So because our objective is not terribly credible, and because our overall strategy is not using all the various different aspects of national power in a constructive way, what we get left with is, are sanctions bludgeoning the North Koreans sufficiently that they're prepared to make the sweeping concessions that we want them to make? And that's where you have to evaluate sanctions performance. And I think here, we can also see that sanctions have underperformed in large part because of evasion by some of the very same Security Council members that voted in favor of measures like China and Russia. And so all that adds up to, have sanctions yielded policy victory in North Korea? Absolutely not. Is this the fault of sanctions? maybe partially because they're not generating the leverage you need. But I actually think the bigger problem is our objective is wrong, and our overall strategy is not nearly comprehensive or inclusive enough of all the various tools and attributes of U.S. national power.
Very good. Emma, we have a few minutes. I don't know if you want to have the last word.
Well, I was just going to add a couple of points to that. So I'm not a North Korea specialist, so I will restrain myself from making particular remarks on that. But I do think one thing that we see in the North Korean case, and we've seen in a couple of other cases, is also the increasing problem that we can't figure out how to lift sanctions. We don't know how to get out of sanctions once we've got into them. And so in the North Korean case, again, we've been piling sanctions on them for years now. In theory, as Richard says, we would have this, I hate the phrase whole of government approach, but we would at least have an approach that used different government agencies, and we had diplomacy and we had sanctions, and they worked together. We would put the sanctions on, we would hope that they would have some effect, we would negotiate to try and lift them. And if you look at the North Korea situation over the last few years, what we see is that to some extent that almost seems like that's what the North Koreans thought was happening when Donald Trump set up these conferences, with him directly in Singapore and elsewhere. Kim Jong-un came into those meetings prepared to talk about, sanctions relief and what would they do to get some sanctions relief. Now, what he showed up with, as I understand, was not a particularly good offer, but he showed up prepared to negotiate for those things. Donald Trump showed up and thought he was just there to have a conversation and discuss Kim Jong-un giving up his nukes. So some of that is a Trump administration problem, right? It's the craziness that is this administration. But some of that's a broader problem with U.S. sanctions policy, right? That we are not actually willing, once sanctions have been in place for a set period of time, to actually make the concession that is lifting sanctions in exchange for some concession from the other side. You see this in the debates over Iran in the last few years when the JCPOA was being negotiated. We see people criticizing the deal and saying, well, the Obama administration didn't get everything that we wanted from the sanctions, so the deal was a failure. That's not really how negotiations and diplomacy work. We see it with Russia, where the sanctions on Russia, some of them state that, Russia would have to give up its seizure of Crimea. Pretty unrealistic. We have other sanctions on Russia, particularly the CATSA Act that Congress passed, that, as far as I can tell, does not actually have a condition for lifting sanctions. And so in all of these cases, sanctions become less a tool of future negotiation and more a tool of, as Richard said, bludgeoning another country. But it's not clear what we're actually getting for that bludgeoning. And so I think the North Korea case is just one example of again, this is just another phenomenon that's really problematic with the way we're approaching sanctions policy today.
Well, I want to thank both of our guests. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Emma. This was a fantastic and informative discussion. We had a lot of questions come in, and I apologize that we could not get to all of them. For anyone who missed a minute or the entire thing, the video of this event will be available on cato.org later today. So look for it there. Thank you both for joining me, and until next time.